Promises and Futurist Dreaming in Positivist Psychology, 1870 to 1945. Annette.
Yeah, thank you. The volume is, the monographic issue is already published in 2013, but okay. I changed a bit the title, but it's still about psychology, and let's see what it. So psychology, as any other kind of knowledge, uses and used rhetoric of future promise in its attempt to achieve scientific, social, and philosophical legitimacy. In the last decades, some ST studies have pointed towards the use of shifting tenses in the public consumption of today's science and technology in an attempt to connect, I quote Brown, regimes of truth and hope. Nevertheless, the use of the future tense in presenting or promoting a certain method, field of knowledge, or innovative conceptual innovation is not exclusive to present-day science and technology. During the last years, I've started to become interested in how scientists, in my research, more precisely psychologists, view the state of art of their own field. The interest stems from acknowledging one of Thomas Kuhn's shortcomings, namely that he studied the history of science from the outside, from the historian point of view, without taking into account the actor's perspective. This tendency became widespread with the gradual professionalization of the field of history of science. Historians were taking distance to such amateur perspectives. Nevertheless, in previous papers on the crisis of psychology, I have argued for the relevance of the actor's view. Ignoring it, it would be like diagnosing a pathological state in a patient without even talking to him or her and knowing about how he feels or what he thinks. Despite its importance, the actor's view should not be taken at face value but as intended rhetoric and subjective indicator. In some occasions, it could be representative for a more general point of view, feeling, or mood of a group of scientists. In talks and texts produced by scientists on the state of art of their field, we always find comments on the present situation, frequently also some historical account on how we got to this situation, and sometimes even promises, outlooks into the future. The use of the three tenses is interrelated through the guiding aim of promoting one's own or a certain perspective. Thinking of future prospects as rhetorical device in psychology, probably one may have in mind recent contributions concerning neurosciences, cognitive science, and so on. I will go further back in time and take a look at some of the most emblematic historical texts in psychology containing a promise. I will try to show that there exists a certain tradition of positivist promises in psychology which gained adepts towards the end of the 19th century and led afterwards to the behaviorist promise in the 20th. Thus, I will use the texts of highly influential psychologists to highlight their view of the state of their art and the future promises they launched between 1870 and 1945, roughly. Finally, I will reflect on the specific features of these scientific promises in psychology which distinguish them from the ones made in other fields. So the structure of my talk will be this, and I finished my introduction. I'll come now to the second part, which is entitled Ribot's Demarcation in Positivism in the 19th Century. Théodule Armand Ribot played a key role in the institutionalization of psychology in France. He published two books. One, the first, called his Manifesto in 1970. I will talk about several manifestos today. We had already one. I will talk a bit about comment these two works of Ribot. Already in the preface of his book on the British contributions, he declared psychology as being an independent science, a distinct positive science. So even in the 19th century, before I was asked, is psychology a science? We have these sentences already in the 19th century. Emancipated from philosophy and freed from metaphysics. His point of view is positivist, similar to Claude Bernard's approach, an epistemological orientation which became popular at that time. As Guyen has shown, Ribot's positivism has some similarities with Comte's, but differed in that for the latter, psychology did not satisfy certain basic methodological requirements of objectivity and testability to be counted as positive science. Therefore, Ribot's manifesto can be read not only as a defense of the British empiricist psychology, but also as a challenge against Comte's prescription of psychology. The arguments he used were not new. They were mainly derived from John Stuart Mill's refutation and his defense of introspection. As the British psychologist was considered a positivist in France at that time, Ribot thereby could show that the repudiation of psychology was not a genuine part of the positivist agenda. I quote him, with the help of Mill and Spencer, Ribot promoted the new, what he called the new psychology, which studies psychological phenomena subjectively using consciousness, memory, and reasoning, and objectively by relying on the facts, signs, opinions, and actions that express them. Okay, shortly after he published this first manifesto, this first book with all these statements, in 1879 we find this magical date where the first, a date very much celebrated because of the foundation of the Leipzig laboratory, and it's for for a long time it had been considered as the moment of birth of psychology as science. So it's interesting to see what does Ribot say in that historical moment, and what was his promise for psychology, this new psychology. In his book on experimental psychology in Germany, which, as you have seen, was published in 1879, he expressed his satisfaction with regard to the new trend, stating, I quote, "The new spirit of the natural sciences has also reached psychology. Therefore, the new psychology is a psychology without a soul, completely different from the old one with regard to its method, its approach, and its aim. It investigates only empirical phenomena and uses the methods of the biological sciences. Instead of the previous formula postulating a relation between mind and body as two substances, psychology now investigates two kinds of phenomena which are related, the consciousness and the cerebral processes." Ribot enthusiastically declared psychology of entering right now a new phase. In this effort, the German physiological psychology was relevant because of its aspiration to greater exactitude, for its attempt to quantify, and its circumscription to concrete research topics. Above all, it was the use of experimentation which impressed Ribot most. So Ribot felt like entering a new world, a world of increasing psychological observation, experiments and measurements, of hypotheses and explanations. Even psychology's outlook had been altered. The literally overblown speech had given way to a purely factual representation. So in this revolution lies, of course, a promise of physiological psychology becoming one day to, I quote, able to enter into the secret factory of the mind. His hope is based on an analogy with physics and biology, which in his opinion have made immense advances. The challenge is impressive. He warned that, I quote, "Meanwhile, the task is so big that even the bravest will hesitate. The magnitude and complexity of the task demands specialization in the near future. Once psychology found the right method, it will be connected to the other natural sciences and will steadily increase the mass of details through further analysis." His prediction is very clear. Here we have it. Where the last century taught 20 facts, now we have 20 laws. Afterwards, we will have laws of laws, which means a compendium of more and more psychological facts. In the end, psychology will be an international undertaking pursued by real specialists. So this is a promise indeed. I will move further on in time, and let's see what happens then at the beginning of the 20th century with all these promises of psychology being able to offer new facts and new laws. The part is entitled Enthusiasm and Crisis Feelings at the Beginnings of the 20th Century. Some decades later, his German colleague and experimentalist Hermann Ebbinghaus would confirm this trend in psychology. He was well known, Ebbinghaus was well known as editor of one of the most important German journals in psychology. He was the author of a famous experiment on memory, and also as author of a very popular textbook he published in 1908, and I will quote from this textbook, Abriss der Psychologie. The introduction of his textbook started with a sentence which became famous in the history of psychology. So it goes like this: psychology has a long past but a short history. He explains, for thousands of years, humanity had cultivated a sturdy interest in the topic, but without reaching any stable progress. Aristotle's thinking stood without undergoing any noteworthy changes well into the 19th century. Only in recent times we find an advance in the development of psychology. He argued that this rather recent and slow development is due to psychology's particular difficulties in applying scientific methods to investigate the structures and functions of mental life, which are fleeting and complex. A second obstacle is the widespread prejudice against determinism in the realm of human moral actions, which inhibits a purely objective standpoint. Despite these problems, psychology, I quote, has now entered upon a positive development due to an actual invasion by natural science into the provinces of psychology. He observed, I quote, the most conspicuous signs of this new conception of the science of the mind is the establishment of numerous laboratories exclusively devoted to psychological research. Whereas before psychology had been a servant of philosophy, it has now emancipated itself and has become to be regarded as a special science to which a man can well afford to give his full time and energy. So, during the last 30 years, a complete revolution has taken place in this respect, more remarkable than in any other branch of science. But despite these rather enthusiastic and optimistic comments about the recent progress in psychological science, there were also some critical voices raised in the field. One of these voices came from the German psychologist Wilhelm Stern, who in 1900 characterized psychology as multum et multa, referring to the establishment of many laboratories which, instead of contributing to a common scientific project, were pursuing their own research line and developing their particular approaches or theories. Therefore, the field was fragmented and lacked consensus. And in this, we will see that other psychologists would agree. Another one would be the North American psychologist Edward Bradford Titchener, who in a talk to his colleagues in 1904 advised that pointed towards the problems of experimental psychology, stating that in spite of the enormous increase of psychological knowledge within the last decades, we are still very far from any complete or rounded science. A more detailed critique can be found in the book La crise de la psychologie, published by the Russian psychologist Nikolai Kostelev, who at that time was maître of conférence at the École in Paris, and who in 1911 published this book on the crisis of psychology. What has been accomplished in experimental psychology, he stated, is only the accumulation of empirical data, but there is no real advancement or common scientific project in sight. I have argued elsewhere that Kostelev used the expression crisis in order to introduce his own theoretical position based on Bechterev's reflexological approach. But the book provoked protests. The experimental psychologist from Luxembourg, Nicolas Braunshausen, is not so very well known today, refuted vehemently Kostelev's pessimistic balance. He demanded more patience. Psychology is a young science. Its object of study is more complex than that of other natural sciences. Scientific knowledge is cumulative. It takes time until the amount of empirical facts allows any law-like deductions. Therefore, psychology's fruits cannot be collected immediately, but will be obtained in the future. So here is his promise. He says, I quote, "With the growing feeling of being part of human culture, the individual loses a bit the pushing haste to draw more general conclusions of his work immediately by himself, to enjoy eating by himself the fruits of the tree he had planted. He conforms to the selfless joy by contributing to the richness of his grandchildren." He goes on with this rather romantic and metaphoric rhetoric demanding a positive attitude, more confidence and patience, saying, let's give some time to experimental psychology to create an atmosphere from where the wonder of the illuminating lightning would come from. I want to stress this really rather romantic language he uses, which is completely the contrary on the language he uses, of course, in his textbook, which became very popular in experimental psychology at that time. Despite Braunshausen's effort to spread confidence, the kind of dissatisfaction and critique promoted at that time by psychologists like Titchener and Stern would create an atmosphere in which would be taken up by Watson's critique and by his and enhance the emergence of behaviorism after 1913. So I come to my next part, which is I will deal with the rise of behaviorism and the promise of practical outcomes. In his provocative style, John Brodess Watson posed in 1913 two options to his fellow psychologists: or to go on practicing introspectionism, a method he made responsible for psychology's stagnation and divisions, or the second option would be to cut with the psychologist's past to start a new unifying project called behaviorism. Already in his manifesto, he promised behaviorism to be able to turn psychology into a real natural science. He campaigned for a positivist and reductionist program that would ignore all kinds of philosophical reflections. Behaviorism would be now a psychological science with practical outcomes. As Wozniak has shown, the intervention of North American psychologists in World War I enhanced a move away from laboratory analysis of consciousness towards a development of objective methods of assessing human aptitude and predicting performance. As Yerkes remarked, for example, in 1919, I quote, "2 years ago, mental engineering was the dream of a few visionaries." One of them, of course, was Watson himself. Today, it is a branch of technology, which, although created by the war, is evidently to be perpetuated and fostered by education and industry. End of quote. Watson's project of mental engineering became more visible in his book on behaviorism he published in the interwar period. It is a text in which he voiced one of the most well-known promises of psychology. I will come to this in a minute. Again, he used the rhetorical contrast between an old psychology and a new psychology, and now, interestingly, the Vibor's new psychology is, of course, Watson's old psychology together with Titchener's and William James' psychology. These old psychologies had for decades battled unsuccessfully with this elusive soul-like thing called consciousness, without ever reaching any consensus or substantial advance. So the new psychology, therefore, would put an end to this tradition. Watson presents his project as an enlightened battle against widespread superstition. He reduced psychology's focus to what can be observed, which is behavior, and as you may know, he defined it very broadly as what the organism says or does. And behavior, the all observed behavior must be described in terms of stimulus and response. A crucial part of his psychological program was his crusade against innatism or inheritism. There are no instincts. We can drop this word in psychology. There are no such things as inheritance of capacities, talents, temperaments, or mental constitutions. All depends on training. So here comes his famous promise. Give me a dozen healthy infants, well informed in my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take anyone at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant chief, and yes, even beggarman and thief, regardless his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestors. So, a big promise. This move towards a radical opposition to the idea of psychological inheritance at the same time implied power for psychology to control and manipulate human beings. Now the behaviorist is able to explain and guide, for example, a change of personality. It is not easy, Watson advises, but possible. You must just unlearn what you have learned and get rid of your habits while acquiring new habits through an intelligence management of the conditioning surrounding. In order to achieve this, in most cases, professional help is needed. This help is provided by institutions such as hospitals and by professionals such as behaviorists. Here again comes one of Watson's promises. Someday we shall have hospitals devoted to help us change our personality, because we can change the personality as easily as we can change the shape of the nose, only it takes more time. He ends his book with a last rhetoric effort to sell his psychology to every reader, because behaviorism ought to be a science that prepares men and women for understanding the principles of their own behavior. Now he clarifies his personal, rather ambitious aspiration pursued in the book. And this is really a very nice quote. I am trying to dangle a stimulus in front of you, a verbal stimulus which, if acted upon, will gradually change this universe. He only wants to change the universe. To change the universe, he would not only need to influence the present reader, but also the upbringing of his or her descendants. He asked, will not these children in turn will be better, with their better ways of living and thinking, replace us as society, and in turn bring up their children in a still more scientific way until the world finally becomes a place fit for human habitation? Historians outline the fact that at the time when Watson voiced his manifesto, he was a well-respected scientist in academia. But this situation would change shortly after World War I, when he was forced to resign from his post at the university. He then oriented his career towards psychology of marketing and publicity. Although his behaviorism had a strong impact on the national, international psychological field, it did not lead to massive conversion of his colleagues. As Samuelson has shown, there were nearly no real behaviorists, although the topic and the term behavior would come extremely popular after 1920. With regard to Watson's influence, Watson comments that behaviorism grew not by conversion of the well-established, but by the acculturation of the young. There seems little doubt that Watson's popular text, which was built around a futuristic vision of the improvement of human maladjustment through principles of behavioral prediction and control, played a key role in this acculturation process. What student contemplating a career in psychology could have resisted the invitation implied in Watson's closing words to join in a universal project of building up a scientific society based on psychological control? Precisely this promise, already advanced by Watson in his book on behaviorism, would receive its completion as a more sophisticated promise and positivistic dream in Skinner's Utopia, Walden 2. He wrote in 1945, and this is where I will end, and I'll come to my conclusion. I prefer to have the talk in 30 minutes and have a little bit of discussion, questions afterwards, so I conclude. Conclusion. Promises of a psychology without a soul. What I've tried to show in this talk is that there seems to be a certain tradition of promise in positivistic psychology starting in the 19th century. This tradition stems from the influence of the optimistic belief in human progress, exemplified in Kuhn's three-stage model. Science was seen as being useful, aiming at an improvement of our real individual and collective life. Kuhn's slogan, C to foresee, expresses this clearly and anticipates Watson's call for prediction and control. In this sense, there is a strong connection between all these promises we have seen here and which were voiced by these positivist psychologists. The psychologists who wanted to convert their discipline in a distinct and scientific enterprise similar to other sciences such as physics, chemistry, and biology had to overcome fundamental and specific challenges. I will say to which I refer here, and my impression is that to overcome these problems or challenges was not possible, was not straight away. They needed to postpone part of their outcome, positive outcome of this size of their science into the future. So I think that there's a link between these two levels. So psychology's challenges in the 19th century, which I think are related to these promises, were the following. The empiricist demand of restricting science to the observable encountered in psychology the problem of the invisibility of the mental processes. So the first challenge of scientific psychology was how to make visible the invisible. Not an easy task. The second part, it came up in my talk when I mentioned Ebbinghaus. He was saying that these processes are fleeting, so there's the unstableness of these mental states or processes. The idea of complexity came up. The big problem of determinism, what shall we do with free will, and if we adopt a naturalistic stance and deterministic stance. There are very deep methodological problems already mentioned by Immanuel Kant, and then afterwards in Kahn's work again, with regard to the observation of the mental processes being a subjective process, the problems of measurement and mathematization and so on. So what Ribot had to do was he adopted on the one hand Kahn's positivistic stance, but at the same time he had to refute him and argue that psychology can be a natural science. So by looking at the 19th century, I would say that seeing at psychologists, looking at psychologists' problems, it would have been much easier and maybe even more coherent just to drop the whole idea and integrate psychology within physiology, where it is within the natural sphere. It agrees with these bodily and observable processes, and so I think it's rather surprising that some positivistic psychologists still stick to the idea, no, we still need a specific science which is called psychology. And strangely, psychology survived. Even it rised, as we have seen in Ebbinghaus' comments on the state of the art. There were a growth, many laboratories founded, many new professionals, a high production of scientific articles and books. So the positivists got the idea that there is more psychological facts found at the beginning of the 20th century, although at the same time we also get this more critical attitude expressing a certain sense of disorientation, fragmentation. Psychology cannot be considered a unified science, and there's this crisis talk going on. And this is when Watson, with his promise, steps in and promises that behaviorism will be the unification of psychology, the real turning psychology into a real science, with a lot of powerful science and with practical value. And Skinner, actually, in his Utopia, shows how life should be then organized scientifically through following this idea. For the ones who do not very well know about the history of psychology, this is only one strand. There are a lot of more going on in the field, and there are a lot of specificities with regard to the discussion in the 19th century, which are different from the beginning of the 20th, in the sense that all these authors, like Ribot, wanted to demarcate his psychology from the eclecticist, the scholasticist, the spiritualist, and so on. And in the beginning of the 20th century, for example, Watson's enemies were structuralism and functionalism. So there are some differences here, but I think there's still a line there of very ambitious promises, and I think it's related to these challenges the positivist psychology felt that psychology they need to address by putting psychology into this selective club of the natural sciences. And well, we can have discuss this if you like. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annette. So we have 10 minutes.
Okay.
Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. Peter, I need to give you the microphone.
Thank you. Just to link our two talks together, I mean, the figures I was giving for the coverage of biomedical sciences in the journals I was talking about, just to simplify the analysis, that includes psychology. And the predominant area of psychology is industrial psychology. In armchair science, especially, there are quite a lot of articles applying psychology to help more effective industry. I don't know whether this is explicitly behaviorist, but I wonder if you could say something about, I mean, clearly they are picking up on the Watson program that psychology has this practical application to change the world for us, which of course other people find very frightening, but that's getting right through into that very, very popular level of science journalism.
I have the microphone already on. Yeah, sorry. I was waiting for the microphone. Yeah, thank you. There's definitely a link in the sense that, for example, Watson, he was already outside of the academia, so his attempt was to address the general public, and not so much. His first talk in the Manifesto in 1913 was in a course on animal psychology. And there his audience, there were no psychologists, actually. There were other professionals who were interested in animal psychology, and he then proposed the manifesto. So the impact of behaviorism was much stronger in the general, in society, and in these practical areas where professionals saw a use of this psychology as a technique, than in academia itself. In this sense, a little bit similar like psychoanalysis. And this is why I referred also to World War I, because I think there was, if you call applied psychology, is not the right expression, but you know what I mean. It's already there in the 19th century and so on. But in North America, in the United States, with the participation and the organization of the psychologists themselves to offer their service during the World War I, especially in relation to the mental testing program with Yerkes and all these, reached a very high impact and helped to expand psychology as a new technology which would be used in various areas and transcend the academic field. Definitely, yeah. That's right. Thank you.
First off, thank you for a lovely talk. It was very interesting. And apologies if this is a question outside of this time period, but I thought I'd give it a shot anyway. The French philosopher Georges Canguilhem wrote an article called What is Psychology? Where it basically celebrates its pluralism and says that the only way psychology can survive, if it treats itself as a science of the soul and a science of industry and a science of emotions, all these sorts of things. Was there a response from these professionals to that opinion?
I would have to think of it. Not precisely of the authors I've mentioned. There was a whole discussion going on. For example, with regard to this relation of basic research and applied psychology. It was a big issue. Wundt, for example, was against all this applied psychology. In Germany, the Grundlagenforschung in the basic research, I think that would be the translation, was very strong. And he, for example, fought for the connection between psychology and philosophy, was essential for him. Whereas in other places, they wanted to professionalize psychology. So they were not so interested in these purely scientific, experimental, proved, veridical theories or facts, but they wanted psychology to work in an applied area, and psychoanalysis would also fit in this area. And there were several efforts, not only his, which said there's a fight. It was sometimes by the historians we refer to it as the period of fights between psychological schools, which became especially crude or at the beginning of the 20th century. And there were several attempts of integrating them all together. For example, I think the most well-known is Karl Bühler's Crisis on Psychology, and his book on Crisis of Psychology, and then his theory on language, his three-aspect theory. There he tries to enter and make an integral proposal, integrating behavior on one side, the meaning of the other side, and so on. So several strands to close this controversy in psychology.
I was wondering, where would you place Gestalt psychology, which actually has the same challenges, uses metaphors and languages of physics, is more or less the same time. So where does it fit in your story, and how?
Yes, well, I could talk much more about different psychologists and approaches and movements, and I'm delighted that you're interested in it. What I did actually was to look, for the first time, I must say, to a lot of texts and authors looking for promises. And I did not think about promises in the sense that already a scientific fact implies. I wanted really very explicit promises, not only implicit. And I looked not in all the psychologists, of course, no, but I went to Wundt, and I didn't find, he doesn't promise too much. He's really very strict to what we have now. Of course, implicitly he implies that his method would work, but he does not go too much in the future. So I found that really Ribot, Watson had these very ambitious promises, and I went for them. That's the reason why. And the Gestalt, they don't have these. On the contrary, in the Weimar Republic, with all these in the 1920s, with all this crisis talk, there's, I would say, a discourse which goes against this very celebrating positivist celebration. But to answer your question, of course, I think Gestalt psychology, for me, one of the most exciting psychological approaches, fits into the story. They are very much related to phenomenology, to the Stumpf tradition in Berlin, and the interesting thing is their challenge against, or their attack, or their kind of protest against this more elementalistic work of experimental work one does, by adopting the holistic approach and working very much on perception and so on. They also looked for a lot of a strong connection with aesthetics, something that the behaviorists did not do. So they're very different, and when they had to share the same historical and local environment, when the Gestaltists came to the United States, of course, I think they were very much in disadvantage with these behaviors running around, crazy behaviorists, with these expectations in their mental engineering program, which did not fit very well with this much more philosophically thinking of Köhler and Wertheimer and Kafka. But thank you. Yeah.
So we have time for one more very quick.
Also, like, thank you for the lovely presentation. And I wanted to ask you about this period of crisis in positivistic psychology, and specifically about the role of phenomenology in this crisis, because Edmund Husserl, in his logical investigation, he said that his stance was actually anti-psychological, and Roman Ingarden, for instance, as a historian of phenomenology, he underlined, he stressed this very strongly. And did the criticism of Husserl and other phenomenologists reach positivistic psychologists, and did they what did they think of it?
Okay, so first I think I should refer to Uljana Fey's paper in this monographic issue, dealing precisely with this topic, because Husserl, in the first version of his crisis work, the title was Crisis of Psychology, and then he brought it up to of the human sciences. So there is European sciences. There is an issue here and a link to psychology, definitely. And I think she explains it very well in the article. So the positivist psychology, it's very complicated because there are several levels. There is a level of an institutional threat and conflict in Germany with the philosophers who want to push out the psychologists from the professorships of philosophy. And there was an institutional, on the institutional level, there's a fight. There's this whole psychologism issue, which is relevant for this definitely. And so the crisis in general, from the positivistic psychology, is more. As you have seen, they don't doubt that there is a lot of production of new facts, but what they want and they don't see is that psychology really offers these 20 laws, Ribot says, that there is really something we can work with. We can predict, we can have psychological laws. And I think this is more they don't care, as they wanted to demarcate themselves from philosophers, they specifically don't want to care about what the philosophers said. This is not, they cared much more what the biologists or the physiologists said. And the challenge they had, I did not have time to point it out here, but it's really important. As I said, the most, I think, coherent outcome of this project of positivist psychology would have been to introduce psychology as a topic of physiology. And there were, of course, proposals there, especially coming from Russia and the reflexologists, the Bechterev, Pavlov, and all these. So these positive psychologists, I wanted to maintain psychology as a specific field while engaging in a naturalistic, deterministic, materialist point of view. This was really difficult. So they had their fights and their demarcations on many levels. So it's complicated. But I guess I answered more or less your question.
They didn't want to hear philosophers.
No. They did not care anymore.
So thank you very much, Jenny.
Thank you.
So now I'm very happy to introduce Maria, who's and Maria is a historian of biology at PESIC in Madrid. Originally an organic chemist by training, but for many years a historian of biology. Her published works include history of molecular biology, history of antibiotics, and histories of women in science. And she's currently working on the history of cytogenetics.
I'm working? Sorry.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, first,